If you're here, you're probably familiar with the series, but if not, then welcome. I've had a few people ask for longer videos, which is very flattering, but something that's difficult to do at the moment. But now the chapters are starting to pile up, I thought I'd start putting them together without me rattling on in between. So instead you just have to listen to me rattling on now. Anyway, without further ado, I give you the start of Fool's Adventure. Please enjoy. Since this is the first time you've met me, I suppose I should introduce myself. I don't know who I am, but I named myself Fool because that's the first thing I remember. Not knowing where I was, I started to look around. This strange world stretched far and wide. The snowy hills gave way to sprawling towers of ice. I encountered curiosities I dare not explore or tangle with. And then, some curiosities found me. As I wandered, so did my mind. The questions of who I was didn't seem to trouble me. I would find out along the way. It was the question of where I was that gripped me. All I had on my person was a small green book. I hadn't noticed at first, but when I stopped and opened it, the pages flicked to life. They revealed blueprints for a wooden crafting table. To my surprise, I easily found wood from a nearby tree that curiously hovered to watch me tinker rather than crash to the ground. Once my hands were placed upon the crafting table, the magic book's pages filled itself with even more recipes. I was amazed to find I could rapidly make all manner of things in no time at all. And in turn, the new items caused the book to flutter as one page was filled by an invisible pen before turning to the next blank page. And, so it was, I had my first pickaxe and shovel. I found myself being lost in the power of the green pages, so much so that I lost track of time, and before I knew it, the moon was illuminating the tree I was nestled in. The night was just as breathtaking as the day, although it did mean that things could sneak up on you. I soon learned that there were things here that you did not want to sneak up on you, and there were a lot of them. The strange creatures of the night were frightful and aggressive. They chased me and I ran, and when I couldn't run, I hid, or at least I tried to. My attempts to barricade myself into the little hole I had dug were in vain, as a vile skeleton followed me in, and I was helpless as the creature pelted me with 3 arrows. And, just like that, I was slain. But if that was all that happened, I wouldn't be here to tell you the rest of the story. I found myself falling again. I was still alive, and although I had lost everything else, with me in my pocket was that little green book. Once I knew my fate should I fall victim to dire peril, my perspective shifted. I wasn't living to survive. I was living to live. This time after landing, the forest was peaceful enough that I could gather some wood before digging out a little hovel into the side of a small hole in the earth. As I was digging, I encountered rock that couldn't be shifted with bare fists. When my fresh wooden pick dislodged some of the stone, the excited book revealed a number of useful recipes, including stone tools and a furnace. That would have to wait for later, as soon the sun was shining. Upon leaving the hovel, a vein of what I found out was coal greeted me. The magic book danced in my pocket as I collected the new mineral, but that too I could read about later. However, coal wasn't the only thing to be released from the vein. Shimmering balls of technicolor flowed into my being, and I felt a surge of magical energy, which the book appeared to enjoy as well. As I set off for the day's travel, a stray zombie lurched towards me. The initial pang of fear soon gave way to relief as, in the bathe of the sun, the monster was set ablaze and soon fell. It dropped some rotten flesh, which I decided to keep, and it made me wonder what the other monsters might drop at their demise. The allure of new things to mine and collect somewhat strayed me off my path. A colourful mineral embedded in the stone caught my eye. The wooden pick felt flimsy against the mineral, and I left what I had mined as nothing more than shredded dust. I wondered whether a stone pick would do any better. Once I had the new stone pickaxe in my hand, the magic book did something it had not done so far. On its pages appeared a recipe for torches. From what I had seen, I thought that the book was conjuring blueprints for things when it encountered the base ingredients. But this seemed more like a suggestion, almost as if the book were alive. It hovered above my hands, and I considered what the nature of this magic tome really was. It didn't seem right to treat it as an inanimate object, and so, from that moment on, I named the magic little book Nelly. When night started to fall on the second day, I preemptively looked for shelter, not wanting to get caught by nasty monsters. The area seemed oddly familiar, and I soon found the pitiful door from my first encounter with the creatures of the night. After fortifying the entrance, I found that all my equipment was laying where I was slain. I'd not expected to get my first pickaxe back. This time, I made efforts to make my hidey hole cosier and more functional. Once I'd placed a furnace down and laid my hands upon it, Nelly told me what I could use it for. I used the night to smelt the colourful copper ore and some iron ore I'd found into usable metals. Nelly gave me plenty of options for crafting with iron, and I decided to use the small amount I had to make a set of shears. I was getting used to finding straggling monsters in the morning, and this time I was ready, for shears weren't the only thing I'd made overnight. The flaming beast fell with a single swing of my sword, and with it some more of those magic balls of light that surged into me. I felt like I was getting the hang of this. I was so wet from the rain I hardly felt a difference when I fell into the river, but Nelly certainly did, because after shaking herself dry, she suggested a recipe to make a boat. Still, the weather hadn't dampened my curiosity, as I dug up a deposit of clay in a pond and found that my shears worked fantastically to harmlessly gather wool from the sheep I met. I was amazed when a very generous sheep grew its wool back in front of my eyes after munching on some grass. I finally dragged myself away from the lucrative plains to continue my journey. That night, in the next hidey hole, I slept in a comfortable bed made from sheep wool, lit with a torch provided by Nelly, who had foreseen the stone pick being used to delve into darker places. On my travels, I sustained a few minor injuries. I was soon better, but sensed the echo of hunger and realised I'd need to find something to eat sooner rather than later. Fortunately, I ran across some pumpkins, and Nelly's pages explained that I could combine the eggs and sugar I'd also picked up in the grassy plains to make pumpkin pie. Thanks, Nelly. I travelled along lazy rivers and ascended stony mountains, marched through thick jungles and sailed across the sea. Day after day, hidey hole after hidey hole, through rain and fog, I journeyed on, until I reached what seemed like the end of the world. With nowhere left to walk, it was here that I decided to make my home. As cosy as the hidey holes had been, it was comforting to have somewhere to put down roots. So that's what led me here. Since arriving, I wrote down all that had happened to me in Nelly's pages, but moments after finishing a sentence, the words disappeared. Perhaps she didn't want me vandalising her pages, or it was a gentle reminder to keep looking forward. And it seems no matter what I do, I'm staying. So, I better figure out what I'm going to do next. It was a welcome comfort to wake up in my own bed. The house was plain, but safe and secure, which was more than I'd been used to on my journey here. The comforts of my home didn't extend too much past that, however. The few pumpkins I had remaining weren't going to get me very far. I had to find a way to produce more food. From my travels, I did have some seeds, and I knew that Nelly had a recipe for a hoe I could use to till the soil. The first step in building the planting bed was a little bit of landscaping, which wouldn't hurt the view from my window either. My home sat on the side of a stony plateau in the savannah. The slope slowed down construction somewhat, and I worked into the night. I found myself being very protective of my land, and I swiped away any monster I saw approach. The problem was the one I didn't see or hear coming. My home, it seems, also gave me a false sense of security. Expecting to wake in a far-flung forest, I was pleasantly surprised that when I opened my eyes, it was my room that greeted me. I hadn't expected to wake up in my new bed twice in one day, but I was grateful that I did. Again, I was stripped of all my belongings, with the exception of Nelly, although luckily I didn't have far to go this time. Apart from my pride, I didn't think I'd lost anything until I noticed that the residual Technicolor orbs contained just a fraction of the magic I'd gathered before. That stung. My complacency was gone, and I hurried inside after collecting my belongings. As a sort of gesture to myself that I wasn't a complete imbecile, I made a chest to separate things that needed to be cooked in the furnace. Quite rightly, that wasn't enough to abet my dignity, and I couldn't help but think that I'd been stupid. What's more, it did have a certain ring to it. The previous night's events had dampened my enthusiasm for building, and I decided to explore the local area to see if I could find food quicker than I could make it. I hadn't expected to find a small village, especially so close by. They were attempting to grow small amounts of wheat on the side of the great mountain that dominated the skyline in the area. Though hardly an elegant system, it did the job. Unfortunately, the villagers were not particularly hospitable, and I didn't have anything I could trade with them. I learnt that emeralds were the accepted currency in the region, and the villagers learnt that I didn't have any. I refrained from shearing the villagers' sheep, only in part because of the looming golem that patrolled the slopes of the hamlet. I couldn't refrain from ringing the bell. On returning to my abode, it did seem more like a bunker than a cosy home. Nelly and I flicked through her pages to see what, if anything, could liven the place up a little. I'd say it did the trick, sort of, and I'm sure there must be some use for this decorated pot. I doubted that the locals would want to come visiting, but if they did, I'd want them to feel more accepted than I had felt. At least the great mountain warmly greeted me each morning. That's when I started calling it Welcome Peak. Trinkets for the house wasn't the only thing I'd crafted the night before. I had the fantastic idea that a fancy new iron helmet and shield would help give the impression I was a serious adventurer next time I passed the village. My new shield put me on an even footing with the skeletons and even helped frustrate them into fighting each other. After clearing the local area, I was determined to get back on track with making a source of food. The grumpy villagers had one thing right. I'd need a well if I was going to farm anything in this dry place. I'd also used the iron to make a pair of buckets. My drive was only momentarily sidetracked when I found a cow and also found out how to milk it. I headed off, a new pair of buckets in hand. Aside from a few sheep that needed shearing, the journey was uninterrupted. As I scaled down the gravelly cliff to the sea, the clouds opened. I first collected the water I'd come for, but then noticed a blue rock under the surface. Nelly told me I could use the lapis lazuli to dye the growing pile of wool I was carrying around. Whilst I had the chance, I grabbed some copper, as well as stocking up on some coal and some iron ore. That, plus a few extra sheep encountered on the way back, made this a very productive day. I was interrupted as I worked, but kept focused. Once finished, the well matched the humble decor of the bunker. At least the slope, on this occasion, would come in handy later. The village's haphazard irrigation system had given me an idea. Over the following days, it was business as usual, and I continued to work on the farm, only now strictly in the daytime, unless I was underground, where it didn't matter. I erected a farmhouse to store and cook the produce. Whilst digging out the basement, I came across an emerald. But after getting a feel for the gem, I didn't dare go at it with a stone pick, so I crafted an iron one. I was really going up in the world. Wait until those villagers see me now. After cooking up some smooth stone to refit the floor of the basement, Nelly's pages sprung to life once again, and this time with a recipe for some more attractive looking stone bricks. I had devised a bedtime routine where I would put away my excess things, replace broken tools, fill the furnace and stock up on food, if I had any. This helped me stay prepared as I came across the frequent but unwanted visitors. The distractions made it tricky to get the well and the farm's irrigation to both flow nicely into the basement of the farmhouse, but finally, after a few tests, it seemed to be functional. Not only that, but my first produce was ready, and just in time, as I had eaten my last morsel a few days ago. I did notice that the pumpkin hadn't grown quite like I'd expected it to, and would have to make a little redesign. I celebrated the birth of the farm with a night of arts and crafts with Nelly. After a trio of skeletons successfully tested the integrity of my helmet and my lack of swordplay, I set about replanting the pumpkins, as well as enjoying the literal fruits of my labour. It seemed now I would only have to wait for more produce. I learned that a skill of farming was patience, which I was lacking. Instead, I set out on an evening walk. My curiosity got the better of my timekeeping and poor sense of direction. Unfortunately, I was lost. It was back to the hidey holes for me. I could have made a bed, but didn't want to risk losing the magic connection I had to my home. I had to wait out the night and try to dig through to the other side of the hill. After that task appeared to be a futile one, Nelly tried to distract me, and we aimlessly made a barrel and a composter. The distraction didn't last long, and irritated, I passed the time by pacing. When morning came, I was even more disorientated. Where was Welcome Peak? Whilst plodding along, I came across another village. This one much larger and with far better farming facilities that made me a little jealous. My tummy was starting to rumble again. There were actual farmers here that would have sold me some bread if only I had the emeralds. Leaving empty-handed, I started climbing local high spots to see if I could catch a glimpse of Welcome Peak. I didn't, but I did spot yet another village. It was comforting to know there were plenty of communities in the area, but on this occasion I didn't have the energy or the desire to visit them, even with my fancy shield and helm. That night, the hidey hole I nestled in was drab, and I longed for my eclectic bunker. I was struggling to even peruse Nelly's pages and hoped that she wouldn't be disappointed. The next day, the hunger got so bad I couldn't even sprint. With still no idea quite where I was, things started to look different. Had I seen that mountain before? I thought the jungle didn't go that far in that direction. I wonder what that cow would taste like. With myself nearing starvation, drastic measures had to be taken. Nourishment had reinvigorated me. Though nearing the end of the day, I stepped to and made my way up the nearest slope. And there it was. The sea stretched out in front of me, which meant that Welcome Peak was there too. As night descended, I started to hurry. That was a good decision, as I was waylaid a number of times. Through the running and some clattering, I spotted another lost soul. But now was not the time for heroics. Dipping and dodging, I made my way back home, and relief washed over me. That night, I slept very well, and in the morning entered the world more wizened and resilient. The creepers were generous enough to drop some gunpowder, and Nelly was very excited. What's more, I found the irrigation system worked just as planned. Even the heavens seemed to be on my side, and they poured nurturing rain over my budding crops. This was certainly a case of all's well that ends well. I was starting to get cabin fever. The surrounding plains and mountains were crying out to be explored, but without any food, my safe travel range was limited. My hopeful farm was still very much in its youth, and just about producing enough food to sustain me ambling around the homestead. Perhaps Nelly had a solution hidden somewhere in her pages. It was useful to know what ingredients I was missing, as well as what I could make. Together, we sat down and started to tease out what we could. I was surprised at just how much Nelly had remembered. I'd been picking up any odds and ends I could get my hands on, and in turn, her pages were overflowing with recipes for all sorts of things. I didn't know where to begin, started crafting things I had no reason to. Although Nelly enjoyed it at first, the weighty load of directionless frilum fancy exhausted her. I made various blocks with dirt, ores and metal, unravelled some of the mysteries of gunpowder, and experimented with dyeing wool. By the time I had honoured my first pickaxe by framing it above the door to the bunker, Nelly was fast asleep. Instead of spending another day aimlessly crafting, I focused on more productive outlets whilst I waited for the crops to grow. Instead, I finished the roof of the well, made a cobbled path, and set out the composter I had made while lost in the savannah. Even after I'd used all the Arcadia saplings in the composter, it didn't fill up. Still twiddling my thumbs, I wandered around and to my surprise found a few emeralds right next to me on the plateau. I had had enough and couldn't wait around any longer. If I was more careful than before, I could safely range the local area and be back before dark. Unlike my long journey here and the recent incident where I got lost, this time I needed to know where I was and also know how to get back. I headed out in the same direction that I had got lost before, but this time noticed a striking entrance to a dingy cave. But for now, the sun was already setting and I doubled back before I got disorientated. The steep slope slowed me down and it was already night time when I got in. The next morning I didn't waste any time and set off at first light, east towards the rising sun. Knowing how difficult the landscape had been to traverse the night before, I noted down a few landmarks. There was the lava pool on the way to the cave, but you could only see it from one side of the hill. From the other side, a distinctive outcropping of dirt shaped like a cross marked the way back home. From the local high point, I could see Welcome Peak, with its little brother to the southeast. Then even further east, there was what looked like a smaller mountain. Or was it just far away? Then finally, from my vantage point, there was a more plump mountain that sat by the sea as the coast curved round. I was calm and collected as I descended the dirt slope. On approaching the cave, I could hear that it was home to a host of creatures. The monsters must hide in caves like this one during the day, only to venture out at night in the safety of darkness. I saw that the cave I'd spotted opened out into a sort of atrium, and a second entrance was guarded by 2 spiders. I'd noticed that some spiders were happy for me to mosey past, but these ones were protective of their nest and attacked. I was lucky enough that by the end of my sword, the spiders dropped a handful of string. I wonder if Nelly would be feeling a bit more chipper later. The first entrance to the cave I'd spotted the day before was suspiciously inviting. Cautiously, I entered. My torches invaded the darkness of the cave, marking my progress and shielding my back. In these narrow tunnels, I ensured to place my torches on the left-hand walls. That way, if I got lost, I could follow the tunnel, keeping torches on my right, knowing it must be the right way. Hopefully in a pinch I would remember that. And I'd never been so distrustful of this part of the cave, as inside the short tunnel, all I found was a single zombie and a vein of coal. Feeling like a conqueror, my spirit was soon shaken by the sight of the setting sun. Without knowing the quick way back, I was not close to home. I stumbled up the incline, barely being able to see a few steps ahead. Wrong decisions hurt on that slant. It took a while for them to find me, but in the end, the monsters appeared. I was stuck climbing over these muddy slopes. Dodging and fighting my way through the hills, I frantically looked for the way back. My delight in spotting the dirt cross soon turned to terror as I looked down straight into the face of danger. Past the hordes and through a volley of arrows, I slipped by. At night, these lands were theirs. The close call reiterated the need to either have food or a better sense of time. It would also be helpful to know a quick way to navigate through these winding hills I had lovingly named the Dirty Slopes. The day's spoils included a pile of coal, some string and a spider's eye. I couldn't be happier. Nelly was wide awake and overjoyed to make a fishing rod we'd both had our eyes on for some time. Our spark for crafting was back. Before bed, I reviewed all the tools I was carrying and decided that I wouldn't need to replace the spare axe, shovel or sword once they'd broken. My deep pockets were beginning to fill. I was surprised and elated to find that I had a visitor. A merchant had made the journey to my home. He had either seen the glow of my homestead at night, or the local villagers had pointed him in my direction. Perhaps they were friendlier than I thought. Most of what the merchant had to sell I had no use for, but one thing caught my eye. He told me that the tropical fish would cost 5 emeralds. I was too short. After politely asking the gentleman to wait a moment, I hurriedly searched the rest of my plateau, and I couldn't believe it. How much wealth was I sitting on? Not only did I come across more emeralds with ease, but I noticed the crack in the side of the rock opened into a vast chasm that might contain all manner of things. With the required emeralds, I shook the merchant's hand and proudly took the bucket containing the fish. Immediately, I began work on a pool for our new friend. The basement of the farmhouse may not have been the most hygienic place, but she did seem contented. Now that the farmhouse had a responsibility to protect the little fish, I had to rethink security. As I suspected, the irrigation might be used to enter the basement, and I didn't put it past a sneaky creeper to try it out. I hadn't envisioned the need for a security gate in the kitchen. It was good to see the sugarcane and pumpkins growing well, and with some of the excess produce, I revisited the composter. The sugarcane worked much better than the saplings did. Once filled, the composter produced some bone meal. I then realised that bone meal could be used as fertiliser. I hadn't begrudged myself for not knowing that, but it was silly of me not to realise that much of my planted wheat was actually fully grown. I was expecting it to be taller, but seeing as I had only just recently watched a farmer in one of the villages harvest their own wheat, I could only admit that I had indeed been foolish. Inspired, I used ample amounts of the bone I had collected to rapidly grow my crops. Upon harvesting, I found that much of the wheat landed on the tilled soil I couldn't reach. Also, some of the pumpkins were invading each other's space. Once again, I started a redesign. I couldn't tread on the soil without risking trampling it, but the dirt I could step on. Pumpkins would happily fruit onto dirt, and sugarcane would happily grow on it. It took me the rest of the day, and some of the next, but I carefully weaved the pumpkins and the sugarcanes into the lines of wheat, ensuring that each pumpkin plant would only be satisfied growing one way. Now, if any of the produce missed the irrigation system and landed in the middle, I could hop into the stream and get out without having to swim against the currents or trample my crops. I was pleased with the change up to the farm, but perhaps I was being fussy. I had also replaced the wood underneath my front door with cobblestone, and even then I couldn't decide if I wanted the door hinges on the inside or the outside. This is what happens when I stay at home for too long. With that sentiment, I decided that it was time. I cooked up some pumpkin pie and, for the first time, bread to take with me. Despite longingly glazing over a cake recipe for days now, I was disappointed when I realised I had never collected enough milk and still couldn't make it even with my new bushels of wheat. What I could and did make was an iron chest piece to match my helm. I was sure to meet plenty of foul beasts when I returned to the caves. Since heading back and forth over the dirty slopes a number of times, I've been trying to think of a way to make the journey safer and easier. For now, the best solution I had was to mark an adequate path with waypoints, where a torch on the waypoint indicated the way to the next, and finally to home. That took me a while, and I still wasn't sure if it was going to work. By the time I reached the cave, it was pitch black. I should have known by now to only start a trip first thing in the morning. It wasn't long before the monsters descended on me, and in the face of such adversity, bravery failed me. It would take more than excitement and curiosity to be a true adventurer. Instead of standing my ground, I fled. I just about avoided panicking, in part because the waypoints actually did work. The slopes were still steep to climb, but they had pointed out a path less treacherous than others through the hills. When I got back home, I tucked into the last of my bread that I had only made earlier that day. With all the trips over the slopes, it hadn't lasted me long. In the safety of my home, I teased the monsters outside that had followed me back as I chomped into my supper. When the gnome zombie leapt through my window, I was so startled I almost choked. I became even more alarmed as two more of the blighters followed, and I swiped at them as they chewed on my ankles. In my new iron suit, I wasn't going to be their dinner. And for 2 out of the 3 of them, I was right. I wasn't sure what the returning merchant must have thought of me the next morning. My plateau was teeming with monsters, and in my vengeance, I tore across it, hacking them down. Ferocity was a new look on me, but the merchant didn't know that. Also, not knowing what happened the night before, I must have come across as quite the brute. He didn't hang around another day, and I can only hope that my reputation hadn't been tainted. After avenging myself, I was filled with adrenaline and determination. I was going to make that cake. I was going to prepare enough food, no matter how much bone meal it took. I was going to explore that cave. In my preparations, I noticed that my copper block had oxidised and turned blue. How long have I been planning this trip? Perhaps fortifying the windows could wait until later. I'm sure that decision won't come back to bite me. I patiently waited until morning, said goodbye to fish, and ventured out. So it was that I stood in the jaws of the cave, supplied with ample food and provisions, and armoured in heavy iron, finally ready to delve into the darkness. As I stared at my metaphorical foe, a set of bright pink eyes stared back. For all my preparation, I found myself crossing the dirty slopes once again. I ran as fast as I could, hoping that the wretched creatures weren't going to be there to greet me. My equipment was scattered in the atrium of the cave, where the water stood still. There, the reflections of my torches danced on the surface, distorting the contents beneath. Imagining monsters at every turn, my heart pounded as I leapt from the walkway into the river, where the last of my belongings were floating. The chilling cold didn't distract me, but by the time I had checked that I'd picked everything up, it was dark. Squids greeted me peacefully as I re-entered the water. Their disinterest gave me a few moments to prop a ladder back up to the walkway. I had anticipated the need for more wood and had chopped some acacia earlier that day before I met the Enderman. It came in handy now, as after I scrambled out of the river, I decided to fortify the small section of the cave I had already explored. The light from my previously placed torches were effective in warding off the monsters, and I finished the wall undisturbed. This time, I wasn't going to underestimate the area and decided to make a bed. As I nestled in for the night, I felt myself magically bonding to the bed, and as I did, Nelly glowed. With my new base, I felt safe as I scoped out the surrounding area. Previously, when I had visited, I was always in a hurry and often flustered. Now, with time, the wind and the sun, I could appreciate its beauty. My calmness remained even as an exploding creeper dented the hill. In the peace of the morning, I tried my hand at fishing. The rod that Nelly had shown me how to make wasn't working. Nelly always begrudged me when I blamed my tools. After a deep breath, I faced the tunnels of the cave. There were a few to pick from, but an angry spider made the choice for me. His feet couldn't stick to the flowing water, and he chittered as I looked down on him. This time, when I placed some ladders, I noticed the structure banished the nearby water. The magic of Nelly's recipes was still surprising me. With an escape route ready for the engagement, I hopped down. The spider, it seems, was taunting me, and immediately sought the high ground before flinging itself on top of my head. This wasn't my first rodeo, and I batted the spider away. In the small tunnels, I kept to my rule of placing torches to the left. With my sword and the slowly encroaching halls of light, I drove the monsters back. The spoils in the first instance were a heap of coal and a little copper ore. Where there were junctions in the tunnels, I placed torches on the floor. One tunnel led to an underground ravine. I was only just dipping my toes into caving for the moment, and not wanting to bite off more than I could chew, I took the copper ore in the same tunnel and turned around. I mined everything I could, leaving brightly lit passages behind me. Sometimes I had to build scaffolds, and sometimes I had to dig stairs into the rock to traverse safely. The copper and coal were becoming more frequent, and I found myself burning through pickaxes. A welcome problem, and one that was easily remedied with a quick trip back to the fortified section of the tunnel I was temporarily living in. As the days passed, I came to learn more about the environment around me. I was in need for ever more wood for the base, and on the plains above I tried to choose trees that were obstructing my view, and hence my orientation. Not wanting to disturb the local balance too much, I replanted a choice few I had felled. After another go at fishing, I found success, with a look from Nelly that suggested, "I told you so." There was a whole school of fish in the river, but as with the trees, I didn't want to be too greedy. I caught 3, but was surprised when the last fish I pulled up was a pufferfish. It didn't look safe to consume. As well as getting to better grips with nature, I was also learning more about my monstrous foes. As I lured a zombie into the daylight, he burned in the sun as I'd expected, but I failed to appreciate that the flames he was consumed by could go both ways. As it touched my skin, I was suddenly engulfed, but the pools of the cave came to my rescue, and for the first time, I felt gratitude for the place I was exploring. I found that the safety of my forward base gave rise to other advantages. It gave me time, arguably the most precious of resources, to delve into Nelly's recipes. In my state of calm and determination, new problems became opportunities to devise novel solutions. Together we made a bow, although for the time being I wouldn't be able to use it as I had no arrows. Nelly had discovered the recipe for arrows when I had found flint from gravel, but I didn't have any feathers, so for now I remained harmless at range. For days I delved into the depths of the cave, found copious amounts of coal and copper before returning to empty my pockets and resupply, as well as adding bits and bobs to my temporary home. On one outing I was lucky enough to also find some lapis lazuli embedded in a vein of coal. I avoided becoming complacent, chiefly because of the oddities I was still encountering. I barely spotted the tall frame of the Enderman that had previously hunted me. It didn't seem aggressive at this time, and I averted my gaze. This show of respect seemed enough to placate the creature. I was losing track of the days. The best thing would be to come up from the cave at first light, ramble around and wander the local hills, only to return to the cave when the land was dark. This seemed impossible though, as the gloomy tunnels warped my sense of day and night. I might not be underground for too much longer though, as it seemed I had explored all the nooks and crannies of the cave, with the exception of one passageway, if you could call it that. I returned to the underground ravine, ensuring to be careful with my footing, making the area safe along the way. Once again, I carved out stairs into the shadows below. I tried to use the nature of the environment and the nature of my foes against them. Despite still hearing the clacking of skeletons, the area was clear and I took everything I saw. After dislodging some iron ore, I was surprised to find a block of cobblestone on the wall. That's when I put 2 and 2 together and guessed that this is where the sounds were coming from. I cracked a hole into the side of the dungeon and reeled back, as I saw it was crawling with skeletons. Steeling myself, I swiped at their ankles, and the mindless beasts shot at me. In their aggression, they started hitting each other, and a brawl erupted amongst themselves. As the noises in the dank room died down, I stormed the breach to find a chilling sight. A fiery cage on the floor was summoning the monsters. Inside, an effigy of a skeleton contorted and oscillated within its magic prison. Instinctively, I knew what must be done, and saturated the cage with light. The monster's natural enemy pacified the summoning object, though the miniature skeleton still writhed angrily. It was only then that I investigated the treasures it was guarding. Inside the chests I found a new mineral. Nelly told me the substance was called redstone and had numerous intriguing properties. The chests also contained armour for horses and gunpowder. I didn't know why the skeletons were guarding these chests, whether it was them that had collected the materials, or if they even knew about them at all. Perhaps, once upon a time, the skeletons were knights that rode armoured horses into battle, and maybe even had collected the gunpowder from slain creepers. Or had someone intended their treasures to be guarded by the mindless warriors? I doubt I'd ever know, and for now, that didn't matter, because I was in possession of some exciting possibilities. I'd have to tease them out later, but what could be immediately useful was the handful of arrows the skeletons had dropped for me. I'd grown attached to this place, and even though I had conquered the cave, I wasn't ready to leave just yet. I had an idea to make travelling back here easier. It was the first time I'd properly excavated anywhere, and the chests of the base were filling with cobblestone. The furnaces blazed as I worked, cooking up the ample amounts of copper that I had found here. One morning, as I went out to get more wood, a group of men stood on the hill, staring at me. I was stunned and froze when I saw that each of them was wielding a crossbow. I readied my new bow, just in case. The standoff tensed, which gave me time to eat my breakfast. Tentatively, I stepped forward and they jeered at me. Ignoring their crude words, I sheathed my weapon and approached to hail them. This may have been the moment of weakness they were waiting for, or my confidence had intimidated them, because all 5 men suddenly attacked. As I backed up with my shield raised, I lured the assailants into a narrow ditch. That created a strong defensive position where my shield protected me from all fire, and I could even angle and deflect some of the bolts back at my foes. The ones that weren't hitting themselves, that is. I kept that up until the monsters arrived. My shield was starting to crack and I reeled away. The zombie lurched past me, instead their dead eyes fixed on the raiders. My shield absorbed one final crossbow bolt before shattering when I was set upon by a spider. I retreated as I fought off the beast. When it was slain, I was left exposed in the face of another loaded crossbow, but quick thinking got me out of that tight spot. Hearing the sounds of battle quieten, I crept forward, this time with my own bow. I played the assailant at his own game, and it seemed that my arrow made his miss. The 5th and final raider was nowhere to be seen. As I searched for the final baddie, I felt at one with my sword. A small amount of skill led to overconfidence, and I found myself peering into another cave just to see what I could see. I wasn't approaching this situation by the rules I'd set myself. Despite some more quick thinking, hubris still overcame me, and I was outsmarted by a skeleton. 3 times. Falling in such rapid successions left my head spinning, and I collapsed into bed before retrieving my items for the final time. The loss of magical power was palpable, and I was engrossed in my thoughts as I accidentally wandered into a village. It was the same farming village I'd run into before when I was really lost. This time, they seemed to recognise me, and some of the villagers hurried over. They asked me if I was the gallant adventurer they'd heard about. Humbled by my recent encounter with the skeleton, I brushed away their compliment. They wanted to know all about me, and I told them that I had recently taken up temporary residence in the cave over yonder. When they asked if I knew anything about the frightened raider they had seen running from my direction, I couldn't lie about it. After that, the villagers were very interested in cooperation and trade, but I really had nothing to give them. That just made the villagers more adamant, and I had to slip away as their excitement grew. That night, as I worked, I heard the unmistakable sound of llamas above me. It took me a moment to realise that the llama's leads were not floating in thin air, but were in fact held by the merchant that had visited my home previously, who was currently invisible. He left me perplexed at first before revealing himself. I confronted him about just how the villagers knew about me, and he chortled, ignoring my frustrations. I tried to tell him that I wasn't the warrior who painted me out to be. Again, an invisible mouth belted out laughter. Allowing me to get as irritated as possible without popping, he finally spoke candidly. He had seen my fight with the raiders, and had seen how I'd fought monsters. These lands were perilous for the villagers that inhabited them, and they rarely had anyone on their side, for even between the peaceful villagers there was quarrelling. The raiders I had encountered came from a larger group that regularly extorted the locals. He said there is only so much one can do, but just asked that if I could help, I should. As he turned to leave, he asked how Fish was doing, and I felt a pang of homesick. From his tone, I wondered if he knew my secret, that on my demise, instead of perishing, I fell back to this world. It was time to go. I couldn't bring everything with me and left piles of excess copper and coal. The toy fort I was leaving behind was still partly the rocky tunnel I had inhabited when I arrived. What I had added was a rough boathouse, and it felt good to have proper access to the sea via the river. On leaving, I erected a few pillars in honour of this place's new name, Copperwater Cave. As I set sail, I passed sand on the bank and grabbed some, remembering the TNT recipe Nelly had showed me. That was potentially one compelling way I could utilise all the gunpowder I'd found in the dungeon. As usual, Nelly had some more bright ideas. On the sea, I saw the little island with the strange structure from a closer look than my plateau. And then, for the first time, I saw my home from the other side. It was a good thing I wasn't afraid of heights. I docked in a shielded rock pool at the bottom of the gravelly cliffs I knew I could climb, and strolled past the monsters in the area. I had a lot to think about after seeing the merchant again, but for now, my home, even with its open windows, gave me comfort enough to forget about that. And after celebrating my return with Fish, and saying goodnight, I slept. Deeply. I had spent over 2 weeks at Copperwater Cave, and it was good to be home. The clear of the morning air was sullied by the realisation that in all that time away, the only things that had grown on the farm was some sugarcane and a handful of pumpkins. Incredulous, I was wary of foul play. The local hills were home to scores of cows, sheep, pigs and chickens, as well as a few llamas. For the vast numbers of fauna in the area, there was ample amounts of uneaten grass. Surely they hadn't been helping themselves to the crops. I wanted to catch them in the act, but when the animals had seen me arrive back, they had run off towards the dirty slopes. What I really needed was some sort of sentry around here, a bit like the iron golems that patrolled the villages. I had rationed my way through to the very last of my prepared food whilst away, and despite the actions of the local thieves, I was more than able to whip something up from what I had. I carelessly trundled around, and after saying good morning to Fish, I was shocked into readiness when I found an Enderman waiting for me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave Fish alone. And anyway, this was my kitchen. For a time, the creature just looked at me with its entrancing purple eyes, which felt rude considering I couldn't look back. Soon I realised that they weren't going to hurt me. And then I thought that I wasn't going to let anything else get in the way of me and my breakfast. I bustled past the Enderman, but as I got close, my vision distorted, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a visage of a castle on a cliffside. More than that, I felt emotions. No, the Enderman had made me feel that. I felt the feeling of home. Was that where it had come from? If this was a way for the Enderman to communicate with me, I had no way of communicating back. Trying not to be distracted by the looming figure, I busied myself with wheat, eggs, sugar, and the Enderman seized my mind's eye once again to show me that they were guest. Shaking my head free of the images and beginning to feel like this guest was beginning to outstay their welcome, I focused on my task. The Enderman left me alone for a moment, but as I peered up from what I was doing, incredulity gripped me for the second time that morning. Get away from fish! Neither guest nor fish seemed bothered by my outcry. I finished preparing the bread and almost fell back as the Enderman zoomed right next to me, and I felt the warm, comforting feeling of home-cooked food, before being dropped back into my state of hunger and bubbling annoyance. Huffing, I said out loud that they could take whatever they liked, and without waiting to see if the message had gotten across, I stomped up the kitchen stairs. Nelly had to pretend like I wasn't in a bad mood as we sat down to craft. But as usual, it didn't take long before she cheered me up. I read Nelly's pages like I was browsing a menu at a restaurant, except this restaurant had quite a few things out of stock. There was a recipe for a clock, but I didn't have any gold, unsurprisingly. I could make flint and steel, presumably to make fire, but I left the gravel I'd found at Copperwater Cave in the boat. I'd love to make some candles, but I didn't know how I could attain any beeswax. Rather than let myself be downtrodden, I viewed the missing ingredients as things to collect in upcoming adventures. I did have all the ingredients to make a compass, which I was sorely in need of. From that, Nelly showed me how to make a map, which I also made immediately. It was then that I discovered that, like Nelly's pages, the map had magical properties. When I held up the map to read it for the first time, colour ran across it and formed an image of the local area. I could see my farm. In the top left of the map, there was a small unfinished patch. My limited storage space was overflowing, and as I crafted, I had to run around to fetch ingredients from various chests. I had resorted to storing minerals in the tool chest, monster loot in the farmhouse, and even though it was in the kitchen, I hoped there was a more appropriate place to store the edible fish that wasn't right next to fish. It seemed Fish wasn't concerned, as every time I came back to the kitchen, Guest was occupying her. What were those two talking about? I busied myself all through the night and finished my toils as the sun rose by making some TNT. As Nelly had previously suggested, I put the remainder of the sand in the furnace to make glass, also adding the leftover clay and copper ore as to not waste the coal. Perhaps being attracted by the TNT, I was left juggling the contents of the furnace as I fought off a lurking creeper that was probing the bunker for weak spots, of which there were a few. I was still wary of the chasm beneath my home. The steep sides of the crevice would make illuminating it difficult, especially whilst fighting off monsters. That didn't mean I wasn't insatiably curious and had an idea to kill two birds with one stone. I dug down through the bunker towards the chasm to make a basement for storage and a place to put some choice workstations Nelly was tempting me with. Without pushing my luck, I dug deeper than was needed for the simple room. Unfortunately, interior design was limited as I wanted to use oak wood, of which I had none. As I dug into the night, I was interrupted by a familiar sound that was becoming all too common. I stopped what I was doing at the merchant's hails and greeted the invisible figure. His offer to sell me an oak sapling for 5 emeralds was non-negotiable. That taunted me into declaring that I would source the wood myself, which may have been what he wanted. The last time we had met, he had guilted me into a sense of duty to engage more with the surrounding communities. I wanted to further discuss about the plights of the villagers with him, for I didn't know many specifics about the situation. But the night was perilous, and in the morning he was gone. I was used to the merchant's cheek and had just about held off begrudging him when I spotted that he'd used my home as a spot to tether his llamas without asking. The stupid creatures were bathing in my irrigation system, and I had no idea when he'd be back. That could be his problem. As I dug out the basement, matching the floor plan of my bunker above, I emerged through the side of the cliff. The view was breathtaking, and I amended the room's design to accommodate. I would now need a hefty amount of glass as well as oak. For now, the room could serve its purpose, and I was excited to place a cartography table there. That began a small obsession into map making, as I discovered the table could be used to enchant the maps into covering larger areas. The maps set themselves strict borders, and I tried to tease out the nature of the magic that guided it. After using all the paper my sugarcane allowed, I set out of the house with my nose in the magical pieces of parchment. As I explored, the map filled itself with the area around me, and I was captivated. I barely looked up as I strolled through the grumpy village, and it was my turn to be rude when I dismissed their offer to sell me an enchanted sword. I should have at least shown some respect for their craftsmanship. On the way back, I stopped off to gather some more eggs from the wild chickens on the dirty slopes. I still had some produce on me from the morning, and the animals flocked towards me. They wouldn't leave me alone. It was then that I remembered my earlier suspicions that, in my head, were all but confirmed as the herd followed me home. I tried to shoo them away, but it was the TNT that did the trick for now. I'd used it to make a small hollow in the side of my hill, but the explosive proved just as ineffective as my plan to distract the animals. Still, I learnt some of the basics of redstone from Nelly. With all my recent petty grievances, it felt good to set off again and get some space. Before leaving, I had enough sugarcane to work at the cartography table once more, and found I'd pushed it to its limit with the biggest map of my home that I could make. The uncharted areas mainly stretched out to sea, which is exactly where I'm sure I could find some sand. Of the islands to pick from, I spotted one that also had a dense collection of trees. I carved a little cove for my boat and named this place Oak Island. I spent a few days there gathering wood. One morning, I saw a skeleton that was running away. This was a new behaviour to me, and I investigated to find it was being chased by a wolf. The wolf didn't seem hostile to me, and accepted the bone of the felled skeleton when I offered it to him. I had all the bone I could need, and so gave him another. With that, the animal seemed immensely grateful. As I spent some time gathering coal on the rocky part of the island, I noticed he was following me, even when I went a short ways underground. I was charmed by his eagerness and welcomed the companionship as I dug out the sand I was looking for. The next morning, I found that the wolf had slept in my boat. With another half day of gathering ahead, I let him sleep. To my surprise, he was there when I returned, and despite my strong suggestions, he wouldn't get out. I don't think he wanted me to leave. In the end, I had to make another boat, but as I walked around with my arms full, he occupied that one as well. Having lost this battle of wills, it looked like I was going to have to leave some things behind. On the sail back to Fool's Landing, the sea air whipped through my hair and 2 bones fur. His hot breath on my neck reminded me of all the friends I had met recently. And now that I had a moment to think, I hoped I hadn't upset anyone with my impatience. But nobody's perfect, and, hopefully, soon I would have a chance to make it up. I hope that this compilation was a more relaxing way to enjoy the first 5 chapters of Fool's Adventure. It's funny to think how much has come on since then, but everybody's got to start somewhere. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.